A millionaire knocked on the door to demand rent. But behind that door wasn't an excuse or an argument. It was a little black girl, sewing with bleeding fingers and eyes too tired for her age. She looked up and said, "My mother is sleeping. Can I help you with anything?" That one sentence shattered everything he thought he knew about ownership, responsibility, and blood. What he didn't know yet was that this girl was sewing more than just dresses. She was stitching together the unraveling truth of his family's darkest secret. And before the week was over, this child would become the key to exposing a decades-long fraud, dismantling an empire built on stolen promises, and revealing a connection that would change his life forever. Let me tell you how a man obsessed with property came face to face with the one soul that would make him question what he truly owned. The knock on the door echoed faintly down the dim hallway of the aging apartment complex, a sound that seemed almost ashamed of interrupting the stillness inside. Richard Coleman stood waiting, impatience hidden behind a mask of indifference, his Italian shoes spotless despite the stained linoleum beneath him. He wasn't used to this, the waiting, the silence, the sense that he didn't belong. For most of his life, people opened doors for him before he had to ask. But this place, this building wasn't built for men like him. Still, it was part of his growing portfolio, another box checked in a neighborhood on the rise. Gentrification masked as progress. The door creaked open slowly, and he expected a tired adult with excuses or maybe a confrontational tenant. But instead, what greeted him was something that pulled the breath from his lungs. A young black girl, no older than 10, stood in the doorway. Her small frame was hunched slightly forward, as if the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. She wore a threadbare dress, one sleeve held together with clumsy stitches. Her hands, small and calloused, were wrapped in pieces of fabric tied with rubber bands, makeshift bandages over tiny fingers clearly worn from work. Her eyes, tired, dark, and much too old for her age, met his with a quiet strength that unsettled him. Behind her, the dim room glowed faintly in the late afternoon light. A sewing machine sat by the window, and piles of neatly folded fabric in vibrant colors seemed to defy the grayness of the space. The air smelled faintly of detergent, old wood, and something burning, but not from fire, from effort, from life being stretched too thin. "My mother is sleeping," the girl said softly, her voice low but resolute. "Can I help you with anything?" The words struck him harder than he expected, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. She wasn't begging. She wasn't afraid. She was handling it. Richard adjusted his cufflinks out of habit. "I'm here about the rent," he replied, more stiffly than he meant to. "You're 2 weeks behind." The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she moved with a strange grace to a small wooden box by the wall. She opened it, pulled out a wrinkled envelope, and handed it to him. "It's only half," she said. "The rest comes when I finish the dresses for Mrs. Patterson. She pays fast." Richard opened the envelope and counted the bills. Worn, faded, some barely holding together. It wasn't the amount that caught him off guard. It was the fact that a child was the one responsible for offering it. He found himself looking around again, more carefully this time. No toys, no school books, just fabric, patterns and thread, work, survival. "You should be in school," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The girl didn't answer right away. From the back room, a dry, racking cough split the air like a knife. Richard stiffened, instinctively taking a step forward. But the girl remained calm. She glanced toward the bedroom and then back at him. "My mother's sick," she said. "I take care of her. I take care of everything." There was no self-pity in her voice, just fact, just truth laid bare without decoration. Richard had grown up in a world of polished surfaces and curated realities, where pain was hidden behind closed doors. This wasn't that world. This was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. "What's your name?" he asked, not because he needed it for records, but because not knowing it suddenly felt wrong. She looked at him, as if deciding whether he was worth the answer. "Zoe," she said finally. "Zoe Williams." Then, without waiting for another word, she turned and went back to her sewing machine, her small hands guiding the fabric with practiced precision. Richard stood there a moment longer, the envelope still in his hand, the apartment pressing in on him. When he finally left, he walked slower than usual. His Tesla waited outside like a spaceship in a forgotten land. As he pulled away, he couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, watching the building grow smaller behind him. He had come for rent, but he laughed with a question he couldn't shake. What kind of world does a child carry this much? Richard didn't expect to hear from her again. And yet, 2 mornings later, in the middle of a tense meeting with a circle of investors discussing high-rises and profits per square foot, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He ignored it once, then again, and on the third buzz, something made him answer. "Mr. Coleman, this is Mercy Hospital. We're calling about a patient, Elaine Williams. You've been listed as her emergency contact." Richard's breath caught, and the spreadsheet on the screen in front of him suddenly felt meaningless. "Emergency contact?" he repeated, blinking. "Yes, her daughter Zoe provided your number." He left without explanation. The sleek Tesla wove through Boston traffic like a ghost with purpose. When he stepped into the hospital's sterile light, he half expected someone to tell him it was a mistake. But there she was. Zoe curled on a bench, her tiny shoulders hunched in that same determined way, but this time her face was streaked with dried tears. She looked up, but didn't stand. "They won't let me see her," she said flatly. "They say I need a responsible adult, so I gave them your number." It was so simple, so heartbreakingly logical. In Zoe's mind, he owned the roof above her head, which made him the only adult she could trust. Richard sat beside her without speaking. For once, silence didn't feel awkward. It felt necessary. Later, while waiting for updates, he pieced together more of Zoe's life. Elaine, he learned, had been sewing from home for years, even while her illness worsened. Zoe had watched, learned, and eventually stepped in. At 11, she managed deadlines, did deliveries, and paid bills, alone. It wasn't just a phase. It was survival. At one point, Zoe stood, brushed off her skirt, and said, "I need to get back to work. Mrs. Patterson needs her dresses." "You can't think about work right now," he said. But Zoe just looked at him. "If I don't work, we lose the apartment. If we lose the apartment, they'll take me away." That was the moment he understood. This child wasn't living a childhood. She was living a battle. Then came the coughing fit from the ICU that made Richard rise to his feet as if it were his own mother behind that wall. The nurse stopped them. "Immediate family only," she said, eyeing Richard's watch, suit, and skin with quiet judgment. Zoe didn't hesitate. "He's my uncle." The nurse squinted at the pair, visibly skeptical, but relented. Inside, Elaine Williams lay under a maze of tubes. Pneumonia is complicated by tuberculosis. Her face was pale, features sunken, but there was a grace to her even now, a quiet, knowing strength. A woman who had fought long and hard, and now had nothing left to give. Later in the hallway, Zoe's voice cracked for the first time. "They're going to take me away, social services, if she's here more than 3 days. They'll find out I'm alone. It's happened before." She didn't cry. She clenched her jaw and stared at the floor. That's when Richard noticed her foot shift, subtly, instinctively, as if preparing to bolt. Then the woman from Child Protective Services arrived, a polite but firm presence, badge gleaming. "Zoe Williams? I'm Diana Morris. We need to talk about where you'll be staying temporarily." The girl froze. Richard felt the sudden tension in the air, the silence before a child ran. He stepped forward before he could second-guess himself. "Under my supervision," he said clearly. Deanna blinked. "And you are?" "Richard Coleman. I own the building where they live. Zoe's staying with me. Her mother asked me to." "Do you have documentation to prove that?" "I can get it today. I'll have my lawyer draw it out." He didn't know why he said it. He only knew that if he didn't, Zoe would disappear into the system before the sun went down, a system that would shred what little dignity she had left. Back in the car, he called Martine, his longtime lawyer and fixer. "You want what?" Martin nearly choked. "Temporary custody?" "Richard, you don't even like kids." "I don't have to like her," he replied. "I just have to make sure she's not thrown away." Martin groaned. "Social services won't approve it." "Then get them to approve it." As the call ended, Richard glanced at Zoe, who sat silently in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes fixed out the window. This wasn't what he signed up for. He'd come for rent and found responsibility, and maybe, in some strange twist of fate, a reason to stop measuring life by numbers alone. The first night in Richard's penthouse was quiet. Too quiet. Zoe stood in the marble-floored foyer as if she were standing in a museum, afraid to touch anything. Everything gleamed under designer lighting. Velvet armchairs, glass chandeliers, walls lined with minimalist art. To Zoe, it looked like a place that didn't welcome fingerprints. "You can choose any room you want," Richard said, trying to sound casual. She didn't move. "I'd rather stay close to my mom." "You can't sleep at the hospital. It's not allowed." "I didn't ask to stay here," she said, not with anger, but with something colder. Fact. He was beginning to realize that this child had no energy left for pretending. The next morning, she asked for scissors and thread. "I have work to finish," she said, pulling a half-completed dress from her backpack. "Mrs. Patterson already paid." Richard stared at the fabric in her hands, then at the small scars running across her knuckles. "You don't need to worry about money right now." "But I do," she replied almost fiercely. "It's my responsibility." He said nothing after that. There was no arguing with someone who had already decided what survival required. That afternoon, Richard and Zoe sat before a skeptical Diana Morris in Martin's office. The room smelled of wood polish and paper contracts. It felt like every decision made inside had the power to change someone's life. And today, it would. "Mr. Coleman," Diana began, folding her hands. "It's unusual for a single man with no family connection to request custody of a child, even temporarily." "I'm just helping a tenant," he said evenly. "The alternative is a foster home, which will separate her from her mother. That's not an option." Diana glanced at Zoe. "What about you? Do you want to stay with Mr. Coleman?" Zoe looked her straight in the eye. "He lets me work. In foster homes, they don't. And if I don't work, we lose everything." No emotion, just the truth again. A truth sharpened by desperation. Diana nodded slowly. "We'll start with a provisional agreement. But I'm watching you, Mr. Coleman. Anything seems off, and I'll act immediately." As they exited the office, neither Richard nor Zoe noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Inside, Victoria Reynolds, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, clicked a photo on her phone. Victoria, chair of the board at Coleman Estates, had always regarded Richard as a polished figurehead, charismatic, yes, but naive, too soft to truly lead. And now, she smelled blood. That evening, she sat in her corner office with two board members, presenting her evidence. "He's taken in a black child with no documented connection. There's no paperwork, no vetting. The media would crucify us if this came out." One of the members shifted uncomfortably. "But the girl, what if she really needs help?" "This isn't about the girl," Victoria snapped. "It's about the company, about optics, about control." Richard didn't know it yet, but he had stepped into a minefield. His act of compassion had become political capital, and Victoria was ready to use it against him. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Zoe sat on the floor of her temporary room. Around her were fabric scraps, receipts, and something else, a spiral notebook. While Richard made phone calls in the next room, she listened. Every name, every detail. She had learned to survive by watching, listening, and remembering. This was no different. Between fractions and spelling tests, her school notebook now held a different kind of lesson. Names of lawyers, dates of property transfers, and something she had found in an old drawer at the apartment. A bill of sale with the name Coleman printed on it from 2 decades ago. "My mom said we had an agreement with the old owner," she had told Richard earlier that day. "She mended his suits." "And now you've taken her place," Richard had murmured, more to himself than to her. The words echoed long after he said them. What he didn't realize was that Zoe wasn't just picking up where her mother left off. She was mapping something much bigger. A network of connections. A story buried under contracts and stitched into the seams of an empire. And somewhere in that hidden pattern, the truth waited, quiet and patient, like a secret in a locked drawer, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. The days that followed were strangely quiet on the surface. Richard focused on keeping Zoe's life as steady as possible, driving her to school, checking in at the hospital, and delivering finished garments back to Mrs. Patterson with her. But beneath that routine, something stirred, both in him and in Zoe. One evening, Zoe came home from the hospital in silence, her eyes darker than usual. Richard waited until she had settled into her sewing space before speaking. "Your rent hasn't changed in 5 years," he said, sifting through old building files he had started reviewing out of curiosity. Every other tenant saw at least 2 increases. Zoe didn't look up. "My mom said she had a deal with the man before you. She mended his suits, fixed things he didn't want anyone else touching." It sounded like a simple barter at first. Free alterations in exchange for frozen rent. But Richard, who knew how his father operated, felt something more beneath the surface. His father, William Coleman, had never done anything without expecting a return. And suddenly, Richard remembered something. A rumor, an old controversy, swept under the rug like dust. 2 nights later, his phone buzzed again. A notification from the building's internal archives, digitized files that hadn't been opened in over a decade. He couldn't sleep, so he dove in. There it was, the original agreement. A binding contract, promising early employees stock options if the company grew. Signatures lined the bottom. One name stopped his breath. Elaine Williams. She hadn't just sewn uniforms. She had helped build Coleman Estates, its first buildings, its early designs. But her name had never been mentioned, never appeared in the official histories, and in another document dated months later, the original agreement had been replaced, nullified by a new version drafted by none other than Victoria Reynolds. And then came the confirmation. The altered contracts bore the same signatures, but the terms were erased. The stock options? Gone. Rights? Removed. Richard sat in stunned silence, heart pounding. His father had promised wealth to those workers, most of them black, and had then revoked it in secret. And Victoria? She had covered it up. When he returned home, Zoe was waiting for him with her notebook open. "Page 27, she said simply. Richard flipped to the page and felt time collapse. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping, a black and white photo of his father standing proudly in front of the first Coleman Estates building. Next to him, much younger and smiling faintly, was Elaine. "She kept this," Zoe said. "All of it, Contracts, letters, even sketches she made. I think she always knew one day we'd need them. Richard looked at her. Where did she keep it? In a shoebox. Bottom of her sewing chest. She said she was saving it for a day someone would finally care. His throat tightened. Zoe stood and pulled another paper from her bag. Victoria drew up the new contracts. My mom said they came out of nowhere. One week she was a partner in spirit, the next, invisible. Richard stared at the documents. They weren't just evidence, they were a lifeline. A buried truth finally breaking the surface. This changes everything, he said. Zoe didn't smile, she just nodded. Because she knew, deep down, she always had. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Coleman Estates had never been so silent. 9 board members sat like marble statues around a gleaming obsidian table. The Boston skyline shimmered behind them, but inside the air was thick, tense with anticipation and something colder, fear. At the head of the table stood Victoria Reynolds, immaculate in a gray pantsuit, her silver brooch gleaming under the recessed lights. She held the remote with the quiet certainty of someone who believed she had already won. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice coated in faux concern. "Today I bring to your attention a situation that jeopardizes our reputation, our shareholders, and our future." She clicked, and the screen behind her lit up with photos. Richard and Zoe walking out of the social services building. One showed her hand in his, another is the tense exchange with Diana Morris. Frozen, frames of human connection, twisted now into something damning. This is Richard Coleman, harboring a minor, a child with no legal or familial ties to him, no oversight, no vetting. The press will devour this. A low murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. "I propose a temporary leave of absence," she continued smoothly, "until we assess Mr. Coleman's mental fitness to lead during a time of legal uncertainty." At the end of the table, Richard remained seated, calm, silent, but inside, his pulse thundered. Then, without a word, he opened his laptop, connected it to the projector, and let truth do what accusation never could. First slide. The original contract. William Coleman's signature in black ink, right beside Elaine Williams's, promising stock to the company's first 50 employees. Next, the altered contract, gutted of all commitments. Victoria Reynolds' signature at the bottom authorizing the erasure of everything. He spoke only after several moments of heavy silence. "These are original files from my father's archive. Protected, undisputed, and uncovered thanks to Zoe Williams, daughter of Elaine Williams, one of our earliest, most loyal workers. A woman this company robbed." Victoria's face went ghostly white. Richard advanced to the next slide. Emails, archived communications between Victoria and William Coleman discussing how to void promises made to early employees, how to prevent legal backlash, how to suppress truth in the name of progress. "You betrayed every value this company pretends to stand for," Richard said, voice steady. "And you did it knowing those families, those people, had no power to fight back." Victoria shot to her feet. "These are forged. You expect us to believe a child uncovered all this?" Richard didn't blink. "I expect you to believe the truth. And I expect you to know that these documents have already been shared with the Department of Justice, the SEC, and every major news outlet in Boston." The room froze. A door opened quietly, and Martin Goldstein stepped in, a sealed folder in his hands. "We're filing charges," he said simply. "Fraud, forgery, obstruction. The wheels are already in motion." Victoria's hands trembled. She reached for her phone, but Martin raised a brow. "Might want to call your attorney instead." For the first time, the woman who had ruled the company for decades looked smaller than her suit. Her power evaporated in silence. Richard turned toward the board. This company was built on stolen labor, hidden history. We can pretend it never happened, or we can do something about it. No one spoke. Then one of the older members, Mr. Peterson, who had served under William Coleman, removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "I remember the rumors," he said. "Your father told us everyone had been compensated." Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "He lied, and she helped him." It was done. The board voted to remove Victoria that same hour. The press ran with the story before the sun set. And in a hospital room across town, Elaine Williams opened her eyes for the first time in days, just as her daughter smiled for the first time in weeks. 3 months after the boardroom exploded with scandal, the name Coleman no longer meant what it used to in Boston. A new sign gleamed on the front of the once intimidating headquarters, Coleman and Williams Holdings. It didn't just represent a business merger, it signaled a seismic shift in legacy, in vision, in ownership of truth. The announcement came in a press conference that stunned the city. Richard Coleman stood between a still recovering Elaine and her daughter Zoe, hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. "Have her confirming through DNA testing what my heart had already begun to believe," he began. "I can now say this publicly. Zoe Williams is my daughter." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My family's legacy has been built, in part, on the stolen labor and silenced dignity of Black workers, of people like Elaine Williams. I can't change what was done, but I can change what comes next. That next chapter began with bold steps. 40% of the company's shares were allocated to a newly created initiative, the Coleman Reparation Fund, designated to compensate families of the original 50 employees, many of whom had passed away without ever seeing a dime. For those without heirs, the fund would support full scholarships for Black youth in under-resourced neighborhoods. But Richard didn't stop there. For the first time, members of the communities that Coleman Estates had once quietly displaced were given seats at the table. Real power, not symbolic. They voted on development projects. They wrote their own safeguards into the contracts. And at the center of it all was Zoe. Now 12, she walked confidently through halls once ruled by people who would have never let her past the front door. She still sewed, always would, but now it was in the bright, repurposed studio on the ground floor of her old building. What once had been a space of silent labor was now a community arts and entrepreneurship center, free for young girls just like her. "The real shame isn't that you showed up to collect the rent," she told Richard one afternoon as she showed him her new design for a school uniform. "It's that you never noticed before." Her words didn't hurt. They humbled me. They peeled away his final layers of blindness. Elaine, now fully recovered, took over leadership of the textile branch, managing a new line of ethically produced school uniforms donated to public schools across the city. The same hands once dismissed as cheap labor now directed a full team of designers and artisans, many of them women whose potential had long gone unnoticed. And still, justice rippled beyond their walls. Victoria Reynolds was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. Her fall was swift and brutal. She had spent decades manipulating systems and people, only to be undone by a child with a notebook and a mother who never threw away the truth. "How did a kid uncover what a board of executives couldn't?" one lawyer asked in disbelief. The answer was painfully simple. Elaine had once been more than just a seamstress. Before her illness, before the silence, she had been a secretary during Coleman Estates' earliest days. She had seen the lies being drafted and quietly made copies of every document that smelled of deceit. "I knew Richard would come back one day," she said to Zoe one afternoon as they sat in her rebuilt sewing studio. "Not for me, but for you." In the months that followed, father and daughter had long conversations, sometimes warm, sometimes uncomfortable, about race, wealth, and how many invisible barriers Zoe had endured that he never even knew existed. One fall afternoon, Richard stepped into her room with an old cardboard box from his father's archive. "I found this in a file cabinet behind a false panel," he said. Inside were dozens of sketches, uniforms, coats, workwear designs, all signed Elaine Williams, 2002. "He was the original designer," he whispered. "All those years, no credit, no compensation, but he knew all along." Elaine, now older but never broken, ran her fingers across one of the faded pages. "I never designed for fame. I drew because it was the only place I could breathe." Zoe beamed. "That's why your designs were brilliant, and that's why mine are, too." That night, as the city below drifted to sleep, a father, a mother, and a daughter sat together, not just as a family, but as architects of a new future, stitched not from apology, but from action, from restitution, from courage. Zoe no longer had to choose between being a child and being strong. Now, she could be both. And Richard, once a man who believed net worth defined value, now understood that wealth without purpose is just accumulation, and privilege without accountability is a quiet form of violence. The true inheritance he had received wasn't real estate or corporate power. It was the chance to love a daughter he almost never met, and to become the kind of man worthy of being called her father. And so, in the quiet rebirth of 3 lives, once fractured by history, a legacy was rewritten, stitched by truth, bound by justice, and worn proudly by a new generation.